Hi, it's Shenuka again, and here's a more in depth look at the Ghibli project as promised. So, all of us in animation know the work of Studio Ghibli and how breathtaking every shot and every setting can be. So, in this exercise, I wanted to attempt to replicate the style from like the painting styles of the background to the actual subject matter of the shot. I started off by making a couple thumbnails of some ideas for a character situated in a landscape. I tried to keep with Ghibli imagery with things like grassy hills, flight imagery, and youthful female characters. I sort of combined bits of the ones that I drew to end up with this composition. I decided to go with an original character and setting, but keeping it Ghibli inspired. I then made this color key as a sort of guide to what colors, shapes, and the lighting would look like. Then I came up with this character design, trying to mimic the types of features and clothing that are common with Ghibli characters. I also detailed the vehicle a little bit, and I also figured out some of the shading and finalized the colors. I then brought my reference art into Blender, and I started tracing over it in grease pencil. I kept the vehicle and the character in separate grease pencil objects so that I could animate them separately. I also added a noise modifier to the lines of the vehicle to make it move slightly as if the engine is running. The character's cape is going to be billowing a bit, so I drew a little bit more of the trousers. I kept each of the animated elements of the character on different layers to make them easier for me to keep track of, and layering them based on how they overlap each other. So there are some elements that will be billowing in the wind, like the braid and the cape. In a new layer, I set about drawing and animating a couple of reference lines for them, with a little bit of a wave added to all of them. Next, going into each individual layer of the line art, I started lining them based on my sketchy reference animation. I also drew in some frames for the propellers, and I looped them with the time offset modifier. I then animated the edges of the pants with the sculpt tool to make them flutter just a little bit. And I did the same with the scarf and the hair. I added a time offset modifier to make it loop those few frames. Now I pretty much have my line animation down. Then, picking the colors from my image in Photoshop, I started to fill in the elements of the character, making layers for the colors underneath the line art. As well as add some shadows and light. I added the detail of the spots on the scarf, and I sculpted them slightly with the sculpt tool to make them look a bit like they're moving with the fabric. And here's my final colored animation. I then started to plan the parallax background based on my grayscale thumbnail from earlier, mainly blocking out the elements and figuring out how I was going to layer the background. So the elements that are closer to the camera are going to be moving a lot faster than the elements that are in the distance, so those need to be a lot longer. For more detailed info on the parallax effect, check out our video on the subject. So here's how my test turned out, and from this I kind of knew what changes I might want to make for my final scene. I then did a few painting studies off of Ghibli backgrounds to understand the painting style. I then started painting each of the layers of the background in Photoshop. So first throwing down some base colors and then going in and painting in more details on the grass. And I made sure to organize each of my background layers into separate folders so that I could isolate them and export them easily. I then added some lighting and shadows on the rocks. I find that one method to get a Ghibli-esque painting style is to start with a base color and paint in shadows with a slightly darker color and then some light with a lighter version of the color, like I'm doing here with the moss. I find it also helps to work with more opaque brushes with a little bit of transparency at some points just to blend things in. And I'm building up some volume with the clouds and adding a bit of a glow on the rim. I then painted in the islands, and I also made the islands that are further away a bit lighter and hazier. I finally added a grainy filter over the whole image to make it look less digital and feel more like a traditional painting. I'm adding some finishing touches, and here's the painted background. I then exported each of the layers as PNGs so that they would be saved with an alpha channel. And then I imported them into Blender as planes and arranged them around my character animation. To see the rest of this process in more detail, check out our Parallax tutorial. I'm placing them so that the composition and the scale of each of the elements looks right to me. I then started keyframing each of the elements to scroll across the shot to create the illusion of the character moving across the landscape. I also changed the animation to linear interpolation to make sure it's at a constant speed with no easing, which Blender tends to add automatically. The elements in the foreground need to scroll past fast, and the elements in the distance need to scroll by slower to create the parallax effect. I also reduced the specular on the material of each of the layers to 0 to make sure that the vibrancy of the colors isn't affected by the rest of the scene. I then drew some small plants in the foreground of the scene in grease pencil to add a little bit more life and animation to the scene, and I sculpted them into a second position with a sculpt tool, and I used interpolate to create another frame in between the two to smoothen out the movement a bit. And now I have some plants that are gently blowing in the wind. I then added a shadow under the vehicle, and I sculpted it across several keyframes to make it look like it's moving over contoured ground. To make sure that the shadow doesn't show from behind the foreground planes, I set the blending mode of the foreground planes to alpha clip. I also keyframed the shadow to move up and down slightly, again to create the illusion of contoured ground. And I changed the line art color a bit from that intense black. And here's what our whole scene looks like now with the animation. And I then animated the character to move up and down slightly to make the movement look more natural. I also decided to make the ground a lot longer as well. So I duplicated the background and stitched it together in Photoshop. Now it looks like she's moving a lot faster across the landscape. And here's our final scene. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe for more content. And you can also join our Discord to hang out with us and other creative folks. See you next time.